Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everyone. Amidst all the tariff wars, American medicine and American science continue to make news, especially RFK Jr. He has vowed to upend the American healthcare system, and according to Politico, it's happening faster than we expected. He's endorsed the MMR vaccine, which isn't making a lot of his supporters particularly happy, the anti-vax crowd. He claims that the measles outbreak, the curve is flattening in Texas, although not everyone might agree. And on his road show, he is making Make America Healthy Again goals central in the presentation. One man who's been carefully watching RFK Jr.'s roadshow, literally and metaphorically, is my guest today. Thomas Levenson is a professor of creative writing and creative film at MIT, focusing on scientific subjects. The author of many impressive, well-reviewed books. His latest book, which is out at the end of the month, end of April, is So Very Small. And Tom Levenson is joining us from Hampstead, where he is enjoying the heath. As a good scientist, Tom, when you go on the heath, does that make you appreciate nature more?
It does indeed. The heath is one of London's great gems, and I feel very fortunate to be able to get this close to it on a regular basis.
Should we be sending RFK Jr. there for some introductory science lessons?
I'm not sure that there is a quick solution to that particular problem. And I wish what is happening now across the United States and the implications it has for the world were not happening, but we have to deal, in fact, with the fact that we have really, in some ways, the foundational, the first steps towards, a real public health crisis going forward. Not a happy man, me.
There was an interesting piece in The Guardian this week, English paper, of course, about America, suggesting, an op-ed piece suggesting that we are witnessing, I'm quoting the title of the piece, we are witnessing the destruction of science in America. You're at MIT, Tom, one of America's leading scientific, technological institutions. Is your fear as great as that? Is science under assault by this new Trump administration and by people like RFK Jr.?
Yes, it's under assault. I wouldn't say that it's in danger of imminent destruction, as in, sort of scorched earth, nothing left. But there's no question that it's under assault. I mean, just a couple of straws in the wind that I've noticed in the last couple of days. There was a report in the Boston Globe, the hometown newspaper for MIT and for Harvard, about a leading tuberculosis researcher at Harvard who has a $60 million grant at risk. And if it goes away, not just the work that she and her team would be doing will go away, but implications for tuberculosis intervention around the world, where still over 1 million people a year die of this disease, that should be entirely curable. There's been enormous antibiotic resistance. That's a theme of my book, But antibiotic resistance has created enormous problems for TB care. But it's a bacterial disease that can be treated by drugs that exist now, and yet 1 million people are dying a year. And this lab at Harvard was, very much involved in leading the fight against it, both from a research point of view and from a public health kind of perspective. If that money goes away, and it's on top of the list, apparently, according to the Globe, of NIH grants to be rescinded, then not only do you lose the work that's happening now, you lose all the capacity of that group, all the informal knowledge that's accumulated over years and years of effort. And you don't rebuild, if the money goes away and people scatter, they'll carry their knowledge with them in their heads as they go elsewhere. But the core of sort of the embedded culture of that laboratory goes away, and you don't rebuild that. And even if the money came back 2 months from now, you don't rebuild that instantly. It takes a long time. And that's the kind of thing that's happening. Another, an MIT colleague of mine just posted on Blue Sky today that an R1 grant that was supposed to be reviewed in February was bumped when those review plans were upended early in the Trump administration. It was supposed to be reviewed this week, and she just got notice that there was a minor paperwork problem, and that her grant would not be reviewed again. And this is, a slow walking way to, squeeze funding. And the same thing obtains. This is again, a really significant, productive lab led by an internationally renowned scientist. I'm not going to name details because I don't want to create further problems. But really just a first-rate kind of researcher. And, her lab is now under threat. And that's happening again. Those are two anecdotes. But the more you pull research, the more you squeeze funds by squeezing overhead, the more grants you pull or delay or refuse to consider for one reason or another. All that erodes the ability not just to do science in the here and now, but to do science going forward. It's the analogy to what tariffs do to businesses, right? We're in the middle of the tariff crisis. And one of the things people talk about is how much disruption that does, and how the disruption makes it very, very difficult for businesses to plan, and hence they don't invest, they don't grow, they don't, do all the stuff that businesses do. Well, the same kind of dynamic obtains in science. If you cannot rely on funding, you can't hire postdocs, you can't admit graduate students, and you can't do the work. And you do that, long enough, and long enough is not very long, and you have a major and lasting impact on the American fundamental infrastructure of science.
Tom, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to look at a new book by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. I think Derek Thompson writes at The Atlantic. Klein is well known as a New York Times writer, both progressives. And in the book, they talk about the need for American innovation. They suggest that the NIH and a lot of these large scientific research institutions generally are very conservative and don't reward, shall we say, dangerous innovation, real risk-taking. Is there any truth that I'm certainly not justifying what Trump is doing to the NIH, but would it be fair to say that a lot of these large scientific institutions in the United States certainly aren't perfect and require a degree of reform?
This is one of those things that is, absolutely superficially plausible and contains some kernels of truth. But in combination with the unstated assumptions and the assumptions, not in evidence, adds up to a more wrong than right perspective of what's going on. Yes, there is an enormous problem in American science funding, official federal science funding. And that problem comes down to, really a single number. The number is the percentage of grant applications that get funded. In the heyday of American science, from roughly 1950 through the 1980s, or even to the end of the 20th century, that number was much, much higher. And what that means, now it's in single digits. I don't have the figures at the tip of my brain, and it's slightly different for the NSF and for the NIH. And of course, there are other very important sources of funding from the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy, and interestingly, places like the Agricultural Department, and Commerce Department, both have significant science funding within their portfolios. But it's 5 to 7% in that kind of range. And what that means is, it's pretty easy to select what used to be around the fundable total of around 20%. You can distinguish, I don't know if you've ever been a judge in a literary contest or anything like that. I've had the good fortune to be a Pulitzer jurist, and it was really easy to get rid of the bottom half of the 300 or so books we were asked to read, and it was pretty easy to get rid of the next 20 to 25%, and then it was going from the remaining 25% down to 30 books, the 10% number, and then down to the 3 we finally had to recommend to the ultimate Pulitzer committee to choose the winner. That was difficult. If you have to choose, only 5 out of every 100 grants to fund, you tend to fund, understandably, for all kinds of reasons, ones with some clearly accessible markers of likely success. And those markers are the labs established? Are they large enough? Do they have the instrumentation in hand? Can they do what, does the proposed research build on research that has already produced publications, et cetera, et cetera? And you cannot easily take chances on, sort of within the top 10%, any combination of grants could reasonably be in the top 5, given the information you have in hand. And it means, of course, you have less ability to fund, plausible and fascinating, but less well-supported grants. Very, very hard to take those bigger risks because you have such a tiny pool of money to distribute and so many really, powerful claimants on it. That's not the same thing as saying, there's a systematic conservatism in, that there's a design intention to be boring in science, nor is it on itself.
Yeah, I don't think they were suggesting it's boring. I think their point was that there's a kind of institutional conservatism that lends itself to people trying to get funding for research, which is not very dramatic or radical.
That's what I'm disputing. I mean, first of all, again, if you actually look at the papers that are being published, just a couple of weeks ago, I was reading a fascinating paper in Nature about the use of an mRNA approach to understand how it is that genes can produce more than one protein. That is to say, produce more than one, compound that will address a trait in a living organism, which is a profoundly important question for a lot of reasons. It's important for basic biology because there's been this mystery of how you can make human beings out of as few as 20 or 30,000 genes. It just doesn't seem like enough instructions to build the complex systems that we actually are. But it's also enormously important for understanding, healthy functioning of systems and diseases. And that's that whole area of research is one that was entirely implausible when it started getting funding 20 years ago, and has grown into this extraordinarily rich and varied and branching body of research that has had enormous applications. Lots of people didn't die of COVID because mRNA technology was there to help us create vaccines.
Well, you'll have to read the book yourself. Be interesting. I don't want to spend too much more time on that. Let's talk about the book. So very small: How Humans Discovered the Microcosmos, Defeated Germs, and May Still Lose the War Against Infectious Disease. The book, it's out at the end of April, but it got a starred review on Kirkus. So strongly advise people in the history of science to get the book early. Tom, what is the book, which is mostly about 17th and 18th century Europe, what does it tell us about our current moment? Is there always been the, so to speak, germs of anti-science in scientific culture? There's always a resistance to scientific research?
Well, I think yes, and the resistance takes different forms. Of course, there are times at which, if you come up in the 18th century, if you come up with a way to intervene in a disease process like smallpox inoculation, which was tried out in Boston and in London in 1721, there was immediate resistance to it on sort of both the grounds that humans are interfering in God's prerogative to decide who gets ill and who shall recover, but also in really violating basic natural patterns. Actually giving someone a form of the disease by scratching smallpox pustules into a healthy person's skin was seen as a very chancy thing, and people who tried it were seen as sort of mad scientists, arrogant, playing at things they didn't fully understand, which actually had some truth to it. I mean, there was it was an empirical discovery, that this could produce.
If there'd been an
milder cases.
NIH around at the time, they might not have got funding. But sorry, go on.
The Human Subjects Committee might have had some real problems with it. But I think through the 17th, 18th, and even into the 19th centuries, while there was resistance to the ideas of some of the people developing germ theory, this idea that microbes actually cause disease, I think the issue wasn't so much anti-science as the fact that science always happens in a place and a time, and the larger concerns, the cultural concerns, the political ideas of a place have an enormous impact on what science gets done, and even how people can think about the scientific problems they face. And you certainly saw that with germ theory. There was the marvelous, terrible, tragic story of childbed fever, this infection that new mothers can get, and that was deadly and was often epidemic. That a single case would then spark a number of other cases. And it took, even though the first insight that this was a disease that was actually caused by doctors or midwives going from one patient to the next, and if any of them happened to be infected, that the medical person would then carry the seeds of that infection to their next patients. That was worked out in 1795 in that thriving medical metropolis, scientific heartland of Aberdeen, Scotland. No disrespect to Aberdeen, but it's not
so
famously.
You mean that, ironically, to quote a very famous 17th century Englishman, Thomas Hobbes, back then life really was, and it wasn't in a state of nature, nasty, brutish, and short, wasn't it?
It very much could be. I mean, and one of the things that, just to skip ahead to the end of the book, I hope people take away from it is, it's only been roughly half a century, 70 years to 50, 50 to 70 years, that the development of vaccines against the common childhood diseases have given us freedom from the fear as parents that our kids will die before the age of 5. Back in the 17th and 18th century, say a third, maybe as much as a half in certain circumstances, of all children born would be dead by the time they were 5 in places like England and the colonial empire in America, and then the country.
Which was the most advanced part of the world at that point, at least.
Yes and no. I mean, they had different standards of hygiene, for example, in parts of the Far East that actually made a difference to their public health. So there's a certain cultural bias that comes as we assess the degree of advancement. But yes, I mean, certainly that was where the scientific revolution was happening, and still all those children were dying every year. It was quite remarkable. And it's only been a very short time, living memory. I mean, I caught rubella, German measles, because I was born just before that vaccine became available. 5 years later, and I wouldn't have had that miserable week and the danger of the lifelong complications.
Well, what do you make of the latest controversy about Texas measles? Is this part of a broader problem, or is this just a storm in the teacup?
Oh, I think it's very much a broader problem. I mean, the anti-vaccine movement was very much on the fringes in the 80s and 90s. And then Andrew Wakefield, with his retracted and discredited paper associating vaccines with autism, came along in the late 1990s. And that was the catalyst for a revival, not the origin, but a revival of anti-vaccine sentiment that has become really widespread, I think. The fact of the matter is despite Kennedy's belated endorsement of the MMR vaccine, this comes after saying, no, you should have vitamin A and other stuff. He tried to discount the vaccine for quite some time, even in the midst of this outbreak. The fact that kind of perspective, and a person who chaired an anti-vaccine organization for many, many years, is now the most important public health, the leader of American public health and medical research, tells you that this is not a flash in the pan. This is a big deal, and it's really scary.
As I said at the beginning, you are a professor of creative writing, comparative media studies at MIT. A lot of the scientific writing, Tom, again, don't need me to tell you this, is incomprehensible to non-scientists. Do you think one of the problems, one of the issues in the way in which the anti-vaxxers seem to have acquired a degree of credibility, which I certainly don't believe they should have, I'm assuming you don't, is because of their ability to communicate? And science needs to also speak the broader language of the non-scientific community, which of course in some ways is what you're doing in your history of microbes in so very small.
The short answer is yes, that's absolutely true, and that's sort of what my day job has me doing. I do most of my teaching in a graduate program in science writing, where the goal is to train young professionals to do this kind of work well, and just sort of get them out there every year to increase the volume of well-written, accessible, aimed at the public writing about science. So absolutely, I agree with you. But I'll add that part of the problem has to be that something I'm sure you've experienced. In fact, in some ways, the fact of the podcast revolution is an example of enormous change in the media ecosystem and the way the public gets its information. And one of the problems I think we have yet to crack is how to reach people who are in anti-vaccine or anti-science information bubbles. We have to find a way to change their or access their consumption of media to even be able to do well or poorly in communicating important ideas about science, vaccines in particular, or whatever it may be. And that's something I don't have a good answer for. I know it's a big problem. I mean, I can help more or less anyone write better about science, but I can't guarantee that they'll reach the audiences that I think most need such information.
Every society, of course, is in its own way paranoid, or some more than others. Ours seem to be paranoid about children. You mentioned in the 17th and 16th, 17th, maybe even 18th century, many children didn't live past 5 because there weren't the vaccines to allow them to survive. What was the paranoia back then in so very small? Was it a fear of not so much perhaps the death of children? You mentioned religion earlier. Was it a kind of religious paranoia in terms of responding to science?
I mean, that's, as I'm sure you know, a very difficult and complicated question. There's a lot to unpack there. I think what I would say is, rather than say every society has its paranoia, I'd say every society has its priorities. And at the beginning of the period we're talking about, late 17th century, an awful lot of the miseries that sort of the human condition is heir to were just taken as baked into the cake. The plague came, eventually the plague went. There is, the diseases that struck children, especially diseases of the gut, the GI diseases that come, we now know, from contaminated water. That was, again, it was just seen as part of the natural background to life, right? I think what happens is you get really striking reactions at points when there is very rapid change occurring.
Mm.
And there was certainly rapid change happening in late 17th and early 18th century Britain. Britain was really, ideas about money and sort of the global reach. The fact that Isaac Newton solved the problem of the tides, and yet, as the great historian Simon Schaeffer has said, never actually saw the sea. He solved that problem because he was getting communiques from British, English ship captains from all over the world. This was a radical change in the perspective for, not just England, but Western Europe and the emerging American colonies of England and France and Spain and so forth. And again, when you leap forward a century and you get some significant scientific advances, you get the first true vaccine in Jenner's cowpox vaccine that can prevent smallpox. Again, you have the birth of the sort of the modern age of empire when the great European powers are expanding all around the world. And again, there's people being displaced from traditional ways of making a living. I mean, again, to skip forward a bit in time, think of the novels of Thomas Hardy, where you have all these country people who are existing in this, disappearing and precarious world. You get the paranoia that's associated with changes too rapid to assimilate and people who are left behind by them and are resentful of it, just often justifiably. They're losers in the change. If you look around right now, there's a lot of that going on in different ways. Obviously, the rise of computation has changed work. It's changed the way we live. Demographic changes around the world are occurring in lots of places. You can attribute Brexit, which was an enormous own goal for the British economy, at least in part to resentment of the flow of, quote, newcomers into Britain and the anti-immigrant rhetoric that help propel that vote. Very much the same thing is going on in the United States, even as the demographic composition of our country is really rapidly shifting. We were close to 90% white. We were close to a 90% white country as late as the 1970s, and now we're under 60% and are projected to be under 50% white and slightly over 50% everybody else by 2050. And there are a lot of people for whom the technological changes, the work changes, the social changes, just the way the world feels has made them crazy. And I think a lot of that is helping to fuel things like the anti-vaccine movement and more broadly, the anti-expertise sensibility. Why wouldn't you feel resentful if the world did not resemble what you think the world ought to be or what your parents told you the world was like? And that's happened over and over again in history. Rapid change produces sort of know-nothing radical responses.
And also a great deal of innovation, as your book suggests. A few weeks ago, Tom, again, don't need me to tell you this, we celebrated, it's not really the right word, the birth of the COVID pandemic. What does it tell us about, or what does your book tell us about the resistance against COVID vaccines? There was a Washington Post piece a couple of days ago about the Army re-enlisting nearly 24 soldiers who were originally ousted for refusing COVID-19 vaccines. It seems as if, and this was, of course, under Trump, the response, the warp speed response to COVID was the best argument above all for science, scientists, investment in science. What should it tell us, and what does your book tell us about the COVID pandemic of 5 years ago?
Well, the last quarter of my book is really about what happens after we figure out bacteria and then viruses can cause disease, and it culminates in exactly this point, the COVID pandemic. And there are two sort of, you've hit on one reaction to COVID, which is this vaccine resistance and this sort of you aren't the boss of me kind of rejection of both medical advances like the vaccine and public health measures like separation and isolation and so forth to try and keep the disease from spreading. Very conventional, long in the playbook, effective approaches to an infectious disease that came as a shock and something really horrible to a lot of people. And yet at the same time, the COVID story is one of the most impressive triumphs of modern science that you can imagine. I mean, the disease was noticed first as an unusual pneumonia in November. It was recognized as a distinct pathogen in December. The entire genome of the COVID, of SARS-CoV-2, CoV-2, was published in January. Something like 3 or 4 weeks after the disease was identified as a distinct disease. That's really fast. And by April, 2 companies had working designs for vaccines that would mitigate the impact of an infection with SARS-CoV-2. There were actually 5 designs, 2 of them paid out. And by the autumn, I mean, this was, one of the amazing things is this was one of the few true unequivocal accomplishments of the first Trump administration. It was, Trump's decision to go with Operation Warp Speed that made the creation of those vaccines possible on the timescale that occurred. Less than a year from the identification of the disease to the production of a functional and effective vaccine. That's unprecedented. That's unbelievably fast. And it was enormously effective. I mean, the vaccine does not prevent every case from happening, but it drastically reduced both incidence, severity, and the death rate from the disease. Those are clear wins. And yet, for so many people, the memory of what science did during the pandemic is almost entirely negative. And there were certainly some serious mistakes made, especially very early on. But you look at the accomplishment involved and the degree of human suffering prevented by that work. There is a disjunction in society between what we are capable of doing and the degree to which we honor and value that.
Yeah, a lot of people, of course, view Anthony Fauci as a hero. Others see him as a villain. Were there equivalent senior scientists in so very small in your book about how humans discovered the microcosmos? So the scientists always been divisive figures, senior scientists?
I mean, the short answer is sure. There have been divisive scientists through much of the history of science, and sometimes the divisions were kind of trivial, or were proxies for other disputes going on. I mean, if you think of Albert Einstein being held up as an example of pernicious Jewish science in Germany in the 1930s, well, yes, Einstein is a divisive figure in that setting, but the argument isn't really about science. It's about something else altogether. But, in the course of sort of getting to germ theory, sometimes what people said about the way, diseases were transmitted directly affected both people's pre-existing ideas about disease and sometimes social, really things that were purely social hierarchies or settled systems. So, for example, when you have the identification of cholera with some initially unidentified germ in the water, this is the great story of Jon Snow taking away the pump handle of a pump that was attached to a water source that was contaminated with cholera and stopping an outbreak in London. There's a lot of myth in that story, and I go into that in the book. But he was, despite the fact that he was absolutely correct and had not just that one example, but multiple different demonstrations of the truth that cholera is a waterborne disease that can be prevented by no vaccine necessary, simply by creating pure uncontaminated water supplies. That was opposed by the medical establishment. It was opposed. There was a argument in Parliament, and financial interests that were involved on either side of what would have been the actions to resolve that lined up. And Snow was, in some senses, a divisive senior scientist, despite the fact that he was, highly respected. He was the anesthesiologist to Queen Victoria,
He
and he
was
was absolutely right.
the Tony Fauci of the 17th century. Finally,
No, 19th century.
one of the issues, of course, about COVID is there's still the pandemic's gone away, but still people are suffering. You have this problem of long COVID, something wrong with my brain, how it leaves a mark on some people's cognition. Was this true also in your history, that people assume that science should simply get rid of disease and there would be nothing left? But are there always, if not long COVID, are there always going to be issues? Do we expect, oddly enough, given all the critiques of science, do we also expect too much of it?
I think absolutely yes. And the mechanism by which we expect too much of it can be seen really in the example of antibiotics, another theme in the latter part of my book. Antibiotics were the great Promethean gift of the 20th century. By the time you get to the end of World War II and penicillins come along the line, and there's sulfa drugs, and there are a whole bunch of new antibiotics that emerge in the next 2 years, it appears that infectious disease, the single greatest killer of humankind throughout our history, has been defeated. We can put draw a line under it and enjoy, expect to enjoy the weddings of our grandchildren, which is not something that any human being could have said before, roughly, with certainty, before sometime in the early 20th century or the late 19th century, something like that. But right now that's no longer as true as it was. There's antibiotic resistance.
The problem these days, Tom, I don't know if you've got any kids or grandchildren, is that they're not getting married now anyway. So we may have to live forever.
I've got a 24-year-old son, and I know what you're talking about. But if you look at antibiotic resistance, the loss of our ability to count on these drugs to get rid of infections that were entirely curable, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years ago. I mean, TB was an easy course of streptomycin, I believe, and it was a strep. I can't remember which drug it was that knocked it out, but it was easy to cure in the 1960s, and now in many cases it's intractable. It's multiply or extremely drug resistant. And that's happened not because the science of antibiotics changed, got less effective, that the mechanisms by which these drugs work were suddenly not there anymore. It changed because we made a bunch of social choices, not medical or scientific choices, about how we deploy these, new possibilities in the world, use them for, feed for cows or chickens, use them indiscriminately in cases where they aren't effective, and so forth. And, microbes get a vote. They learned how to resist these drugs, and now we're in a predicament. We're in a pickle.
Well, we're in a less of a pickle, Tom, because we have erudite men like yourself with their histories of science, so very small, how humans discovered the microcosmos, defeated germs, and may still lose the war against infectious disease. You not only a writer, you teach this stuff. It's important to have enlightened figures like yourself and enlightened books. Congratulations on the book. It's out, at the end of the month?
Indeed. In the U.S. on April 29th, in England and in Great Britain on May 1st. And I'll just say that pre-orders are always a book's and an author's best friend.
Yeah, well, it definitely, it's getting great reviews already. It was starred on Kirkus, an important book for anyone interested in the history of science and in vaccines in particular, so relevant in our age of RFK Jr. and paranoia about vaccines. Tom, congratulations on the new book. Enjoy London, and we'll have you back on the show as the RFK Jr. age plays out. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been great talking to you.